Well, we'll go ahead and get started. So, as she said, I'm Fernando Tomlinson. I'm happy to be here today. I'm certainly happy that you all have joined in for my talk as we start to talk about PowerShell in many different facets. So the flow for today will really be highlighting some of the history of PowerShell, the advantages of the language. We'll do some comparison between Windows PowerShell and PowerShell Core. We'll highlight how do you get started with the language, and then we'll sum it up with me sharing some resources with you, right? So you can walk away and put some of this stuff to good use, but also continue your learning and being able to advance your ability in PowerShell as a whole. All right, so this whole PowerShell thing, right? It was introduced in 2006 by Microsoft, specifically on Windows PowerShell. It's an object-oriented scripting language. So when you hear object-oriented, you're probably like, well, what is that, right? We could think of, your car as an object, and then your car has many attributes associated with it. One of those attributes might be the make, the model, the color, the year, right? All of those things associated with the object being the car. Well, PowerShell operates in the same manner. With all the data that it retrieves and interacts with, it treats them as objects. And as we go through this talk, you'll see one case where that is hugely beneficial, but certainly as you continue your endeavors with the language, you'll certainly see it to be a significant increase in your ability to do things with the language. It's an automation platform. So from a system administration perspective or defensive, person offensive, it really doesn't matter. You can automate tasks built into the operating system to allow you to repeatedly, on a time schedule, be able to accomplish certain things. It's a remote management framework, meaning that I can be on workstation 1 and be able to access workstation 2 in the same manner that I would do my own workstation. It isn't necessarily a one-to-one. It also has the ability to do one-to-many. Being able to do that right from the PowerShell language console is certainly beneficial. The last thing I'll say here is functionalities in the language is generally provided by what we call commandlets. And these commandlets, they really follow a format of verb noun. So these verb noun formats of the commandlets really allow us to utilize the language. And when we look at what these verb nouns look like, well, we can execute get verb within our PowerShell window, and we'll see roughly 100 of them. I only have about 32 on the screen here. But when I'm thinking about trying to retrieve information, well, the verb get sounds like I would be retrieving information, and I've highlighted it there because not only does it show the verbs itself, it shows some other information associated with it. If we wanted to remove information, well, that sounds like or we want to delete, that sounds like we would be removing. If we wanted to create something, that sounds like new. And then if we wanted to alter something, that sounds like set. The good thing is if you don't fully understand the verbs associated with the language, being able to type in get dash verb brings this information up so that way you can start to get introduced, exposed to the verbs within PowerShell. And then guess what? As soon as you start to fully take in that when you see get, that insinuates you're retrieving information, you can rinse and repeat that with nearly any and every commandlet that you see within the PowerShell language. From an advantages perspective, the blue team has a number of them. And when we say blue team, we're talking about people doing defensive actions, security operations actions within a network, right? So from that perspective, they have access to essentially all the APIs within Windows. And these APIs are application programming interfaces, essentially a set of definitions that are used to build and integrate application software within an operating system. So the fact that these APIs exist in the operating system in Windows or excuse me, PowerShell as a whole has access to it, then allows us to interoperate our ability and our code and really develop more, because we're able to dial into some of these things that are already there. We have the ability to track and really highlight the abuse of the language across an entire enterprise. We can essentially encrypt our traffic. So when you hear about, people using packet sniffers and, traffic being transmitted in the clear, i.e. not encrypted, PowerShell has the ability where we can encrypt that, making it difficult and in some cases nearly impossible for somebody to be able to read our communication. This is good from a blue team perspective. As you could imagine, I don't want to be querying a machine and have the data that I'm retrieving back just floating in the wind where anybody can essentially capture that traffic and make some sense of it. We also can build tools and capabilities that allow us to monitor what's going on in our network. So if we can't afford the next generation endpoint security platform, or our organization doesn't allow us to use certain things based upon where we currently sit or rules and regulations, well, we can utilize PowerShell to be able to minimize our impact for not having that, but certainly give us the visibility that we may desire. We also have the ability to look at this from a red team perspective. And from a red team perspective, we'll see things like the ability to bypass and avoid detection. So that's good because, again, it being a scripting language, we can execute it in such a way to where we can certainly bypass detection mechanisms. And then as these detection mechanisms illuminate themselves and prevent us from doing things, we can then alter the code to then continuously be on the cutting edge of what we're doing. Conversely, we mentioned these APIs just a minute ago and how that was useful for a blue team. It's also useful for a red team. And since these are script-based attacks, it certainly makes being able to signature them very difficult. I see some detection mechanisms and signature detection mechanisms where they try to highlight keywords in particular PowerShell code to be able to highlight their maliciousness. However, it takes nothing for a person to be able to alter that word that's in there to something else. So it certainly makes it difficult for somebody to stay abreast of it. And when we look at this some more, there are a couple of things that, well, they're equally beneficial to a blue team as they are beneficial to a red team member. Yes, you are absolutely correct. Now, we're not finished talking about a red team member or really anybody of malicious intent at large, because I'm going to bring you to another thing where we're talking about CISA, right? So we understand CISA is a US government entity really charged with how the government does defense and helping with rules and regulations, regulatory guidance. Now, they do essentially assessments, risk vulnerability assessments with different organizations, and they use the MITRE ATT&CK framework. The MITRE ATT&CK framework is essentially a subset of tactics, techniques that have been shown to be used by malicious actors. These are categorized in a number of different subsets. Now, I say all that to say, from the execution perspective, execution is essentially how do I get my malicious code to execute, because malicious code by itself, it poses no threat unless it's actually executing. So malicious actors want to get whatever their malware is, whatever their capability is to execute on a system. Overwhelmingly, PowerShell is leading the way as far as what malicious actors are using to execute their code. Now, albeit this is what CISA sees from their perspective and the organizations that they've done these assessments with. So we can take that with a grain of salt and not say, well, this doesn't account for the whole world, but giving the responsibility of CISA, certainly this is worthwhile. And it's not by just a couple of a percent. It's nearly, double almost from the next one right behind it. So it's really a big thing. Now, we highlighted blue team using it. We highlighted the red team using it. There's also system administrators. And really, PowerShell as a whole was generally made for system administrators to help them with their tasks, to automate some of the things that they were doing, to be able to retrieve information in such a manner that was useful for a system administrator. So when we look at the landscape, this is a capability for one entity versus the next. There's some shared overage, if you will, in the capability from different entities. And there's some pieces of it that really apply to only that entity itself. It really depends on the intent in which I'm trying to accomplish, and really the timing and scope in which I am on a particular mission, if you will. So just to provide something else, RedMonk provides a programming language rankings generally once a quarter. They're a little bit behind. This is the latest one that they have. And what I found by looking at RedMonk, because it's a little bit difficult to find these types of numbers out there, they have taken the number of projects on GitHub. GitHub is a repository, open source platform where people can generate code, they can post it there, other people can help with that code, kind of get it crowdsourced, just an open source platform, right? And then based upon the number of tags in Stack Overflow, if you've ever Googled some type of programming like question, Stack Overflow was probably one of the top 3 or 4 responses that came back. So based upon the number of tags that are in that platform. And then we have our access there. PowerShell isn't at the top, but it's nearly at the top. It's actually number 17 out of whatever amount that's on here. Now, as a enthusiast and a lover of PowerShell, I'm not mad that it's not at the top. I see things above PowerShell that probably should be there, right? Like the language that's used to build Microsoft Windows, the language that's used to build iOS from an Apple perspective, you know, some other core languages as well. So I just really want to highlight that PowerShell is certainly being used, as noted by its position from what RedMonk has noted based upon the popularity in GitHub and the popularity of tags based upon its resonance in Stack Overflow. Okay, so now that we've gotten that out of the way, we're really now talking about the versions. And as we really delineate the different versions, then it paves itself very well for us to kind of move over to PowerShell core. So Windows PowerShell comes inherent on Windows operating systems. And on the chart I have there, I've noted the operating system. I've also noted the version of Windows PowerShell that is installed by default. So if you have a Windows 7 machine and you fired up PowerShell right now, you would have PowerShell version 2 on there by default. If you've had a Windows 10 machine and you fired up PowerShell, it would be version 5 by default. Every version provides some new level of functionality and security, right? So certainly the newer the version, the better. Now, Microsoft is no longer developing Windows PowerShell. They've ceased after version 5. Instead, they are developing PowerShell Core, and that is cross-platform. So now I can run PowerShell Core on Windows, Mac OS, Linux, as we're talking about here today, and a number of other specialty platforms. PowerShell Core starts off with version 6 and then has version 7. By default, PowerShell Core is not installed on any operating system, so it's something that we would need to install. We can certainly run PowerShell Core and Windows PowerShell together on a Windows platform, just in case you wanted to be able to do that. So how do we go about getting PowerShell Core? Well, first, let's talk about a little bit of history of it. It was announced in 2016, released in 2018. We've noted that it's cross-platform. We've also noted that Windows, Mac OS, Linux, and there's a number of other operating systems and specialty systems as well. When we're in Microsoft Windows, we can launch PowerShell by calling upon pwsh.exe. When we see .exe, that's a general thing for actual Windows, although we can execute them in some respect on other platforms. On a Mac or Linux, we can call upon pwsh. Nonetheless, you start to see the commonality in what it's known as on either one of those platforms. So installing PowerShell core, and we're talking specifically from a Linux perspective. Now that PowerShell is open source, which is what they did when they came up with PowerShell core, meaning they now have publicized the code and everything about PowerShell, and nothing stops you, me, or somebody else from going out to GitHub and being able to add to the PowerShell project and make it better. So now it's being crowdsourced. That code is on GitHub, the platform that I mentioned just a few minutes ago. So we can browse to GitHub, we can manually download the software, and then we can install it on our system, and we'll have PowerShell core. We could also execute a one-liner, essentially one line of code to, in an automated fashion, go out, download the PowerShell software, and then auto install it for us. Okay, so that's pretty cool. I probably would want to do the latter option, and let's walk through that. So utilizing option 2, I'm going to specify what's called wget. And within Linux, because now we're in a Linux terminal, a command line terminal, wget allows me through the command line to interact with web applications. So I'm browsing through the command line using wget out to aka.microsoft, and I'm downloading that code called install PowerShell.sh. sh is a bash script. Bash is a different language that's inherent to Linux, as we're on Linux right now. So we're just utilizing that inherent language to be able to install our new language that we're interested in. From there, I'm going to install or essentially execute that script. And the way I'll do that is I'll call upon something called sudo. And sudo is going to allow me to execute commands that I generally wouldn't have the ability to do as a regular user, but it's going to allow me to execute those commands in the context of a more privileged user. And when I try to do that, it's going to ask me for my credentials as noted there. Now, once that is all done, I'm then going to remove the script. So in a matter of, let's say, 30 seconds, I'm able to go out, get the code, download it, install it, and I'm good to go with PowerShell core on my Linux machine. Whoa. All right, well, now I got to execute some commands. So back in my terminal command line window in Linux, I have 2 options. Option 1 is for me to be able to go into or create a PowerShell process, execute PowerShell commands just as long as I want to, one after the other, and then when I'm finally done, exit out of there. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm specifying pwsh. Notice that right before the pwsh, it says Nando @CentOS. That's my present working directory, if you will, my current path. And then right after that, I then get essentially that path changing. It now begins with PS. That insinuates that I'm now in a PowerShell process. And once I'm in that PowerShell process, I can specify those commands, one after the other, discontinuously while I'm in that one process. The command that I'm doing now is get host. Well, we realized that get is retrieving. So I'm retrieving information about the host. And what I get back is a subset of information, but most importantly out of there, what I get back is the version. Cool. Now, when it's all said and done, because I'm in a PowerShell process, I'm going to type exit. And after I type exit, it would bring me back to the prompt that says Nando @CentOS. Now, we also have the option to create the PowerShell process execute a command and bring us right back to the CentOS prompt. Okay, and that's what we're doing with option 2. So notice here, PWSH, we're specifying a parameter command, and then we're going to feed it the command to execute. That command is no different than what we were executing in our previous method. And what we get back is the exact same thing. But notice it automatically dropped me right back into my terminal prompt with Nando at CentOS. So we have 2 different methods for us to be able to execute this PowerShell code, not saying one is better than the other, but certainly want to highlight to you that you have multiple ways to be able to do that. Okay, so no matter what side of the fence you're on, whether you're a system administrator or you're aspiring to be one, or aspiring to be somebody on the defensive side or offensive red team side, there's a number of things, as we determined, that are things that you would do that could span different facets. And some of them are listed before you. And we call them a system survey, right? So if I'm a red team person and I've gained access to a machine, the first thing I would want to do is be able to understand the makeup of the machine, like who's logged on, what processes are running, what software is installed. If I'm a blue teamer or a defensive person and I am trying to proactively look to see if the system has been compromised, I might try to do those same things. Now, my reasoning would be possibly slightly different. However, I'm executing the same commands. And the same could go for a system administrator. But let's say we had a supervisor who said, I need you to retrieve a list of running processes. So when I open up, let's say Microsoft Word, that's a process that's running. When I open up Notepad, that's a process that's running. Internet Explorer or Chrome or whatever your browser of choice is, that's a process that's running. I want to be able to see all those running processes. Well, I'm new to PowerShell. I don't even know how to do that, right? And I'm in Linux. Well, let's walk through a methodology that gets you where you need to be, that you can rinse and repeat with and use in other aspects. All right, so PowerShell has this thing called get help. It's a commandlet, get-help. You already have come to the determination what get generally means, retrieve some information. So I'm going to do get-help process. So now I'm going to retrieve any help documentation with the word process in it. And I get roughly 8 items back. Some of them are like exit, right? That tells me it's probably going to close out. One is like start. That sounds like it's creating, right? But I do see one that says get process. And now what I'm able to do is shift over to the synopsis field, and I can read the synopsis associated with it. And that synopsis is telling me that it gets the processes that are currently running on a local machine. Okay, that's awesome. This might be what I need, but I'm not quite sure yet. So now that I have that commandlet, I can do get help dash get process, or excuse me, get help space get dash process. And what does it do? Well, it gives me the name synopsis and a little bit more information, right? But down at the bottom, I also have this remarks field where it gives me the option to be able to go out and get the full help documentation. I can get the details associated with the help documentation, or I can get examples. Examples. So these examples, when I call upon get-help, get-process, -examples, well, it's going to give me examples of how to use that commandlet. Depending on the commandlet you're looking at, it could give you one example. I've seen some that gives up to like 14, somewhere in between may be your number. But at any case, an example of using it is certainly worth our time and effort to check out. So when I see this, and I've only captured 2 examples on the screen, it gives us information about it. Cool. The first one gets a list of active running processes on a local computer. Awesome. And then it tells us the specific command to use. Wow, right? And then we get a more detailed synopsis associated with it. Now, based upon this, I think get process by itself is what I'm looking for. So I'm going to go ahead and execute that. And when I do, I get a number of things back to the screen. Those attributes that I talked about earlier, these properties, well, I see them going along the top. NPM, PM, WS, CPU, ID, SI, process name. Those are all attributes about the object being get processed in this case. Okay, well, I don't care to see all of that. I really only want to see things like the process name, because that's important. And then I want to see the process ID. This process ID is a unique identifier associated with the active running process. While it's unique in nature, there are some processes that when they execute will have a very static one. However, I want to only see those two things, the ID and the process name. So how do I do that? Well, if I'm going to use bash, that is that inherent language that we mentioned earlier, there's a couple of ways for us to do that. And doing that, well, is very cumbersome. It's not something that is easily repeatable. You're really kind of finagling the data and manipulating it. However, with PowerShell, we can literally just do get process, pipe, which is a straight up and down, and then we can select the object that we care about. In this case, we care about the object or the property called ID. And looking at my screenshot, let's say you want to get the name as well. Well, you just add a comma and then you can add name there and you get only that information back. Because it's object oriented, you can get that same information. Because we're now going from Windows PowerShell to PowerShell Core, the cross-platform aspect is huge. And I use this person as an example. This person is business casual ready, business ready. He's ready to go to the ballpark, right? He has one outfit that he weighs. And in some cultures, maybe this is accepted. In other cultures, it's odd, right? But the fact that he can have that attire and use it in many different facets is huge. Okay, so as we bring this kind of to the end, we've identified the language can be installed very quickly. We've highlighted how helpful the help documentation is, and certainly because Windows PowerShell is already on Windows, being able to have PowerShell on Linux gives us an object-oriented language that is on both platforms. Not to say that this is the only object-oriented platform that's out there. All right. No good commercial goes on without something like this. So here's the point where I'm going to give you something for your kit bag. And I recognize I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. Now, ABC, right? You always have to be coding to be able to get better at PowerShell. There's the get help function that I talked about. And if you're coming from, let's say, managing routers or something else, with particularly routers and network equipment, you can generally hit the tab key and it will auto-complete. PowerShell is the same way. One of the best books that I've ever seen was PowerShell in a Month of Lunches. It is not free, but it's fairly inexpensive. And every day for a month, you can learn more about PowerShell through text and hands-on. I also run 2 challenge-based PowerShell learning platforms that I'll talk about here in a second, and then being able to use a quick reference sheet. I happen to have a quick reference sheet, although maybe a little small for you to read now. As soon as this is over with, I'm going to put the link to this quick reference sheet in my hallway chat. The idea here is you can print this out, put it on your desk, and there's a number of things that you'll rinse and repeat and always use within PowerShell. So slowly but surely, you'll go from looking at it every day to not even needing it. One of the PowerShell platforms that I was mentioning is called Under the Wire. 75 linear challenges, one after the other, where it's focused on the core aspects of PowerShell. We allow you to connect to our servers. Me and 3 of my buddies put this together, and we'll present you with challenges. As you answer one challenge, the answer becomes the password for the next challenge. And then you'll rinse and repeat that for the 75 challenges. Thus far, we've had almost 200,000 unique players from over 78 countries. The biggest thing about this is it is free. When you need help or assistance, you're going to get me or you're going to get one of my buddies. When you're done with that, I also created Posh Hunter. Posh Hunter's 90 interactive challenges focus on red and blue team tactics. It is also free. I give you a virtual machine that you'll go and download. It's riddled with artifacts. I'll have you complete scenario-based challenges and supply those answers back to my my gaming server to get points, if you will. But every one of those challenges are based upon real-world, firsthand things that I've seen in my endeavor, right? So this isn't things that would never ever happen, and you're only using PowerShell. Through both of these platforms, you're going to be introduced to things that you've never seen before, which is an opportunity for you to grow. All right, with that being said, I believe I'm out of time. However, here's a couple of links that are important. Maybe you want to jot them down. If not, no worries. I will put them in the Slack chat right after this, and that's where I'll be hanging out for the rest of the day, catching up on some of the content here. So with that, I yield back to you.